They had no idea I'd already spoken to my attorney 3 weeks before any of it came to a head. They thought I was just a quiet old man who would accept whatever they decided. That was their first mistake. And honestly, looking back now, sitting on the porch of my house overlooking the lake, I almost want to thank them. Almost. My name is Walter, and I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer, built a career from nothing, and retired early with more in the bank than most people see in 3 lifetimes. My wife, Carol, passed away 6 years ago from pancreatic cancer. It was fast. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. There are no words for that kind of loss. And I won't try to find them here. What I will say is that after she was gone, the house we had shared for 27 years felt like a museum. Every room held something of hers. Her reading glasses on the kitchen counter. Her handwriting on sticky notes still stuck inside cabinet doors. I kept them all. I couldn't bring myself to move a single thing. My son came to me about 2 years after she passed. He was 31 at the time, working in sales, which meant he was good at talking and not especially good at saving. He had just gotten married to a woman named, and I will simply call her my daughter-in-law, because that is what she was, at least on paper. They were renting an apartment across town, and he told me they were struggling. The lease was up, they couldn't afford to renew it, and could they please stay with me for a while, just until they got back on their feet? I said yes. Of course I said yes. He was my son. I want to be clear about something, because this matters. The house was mine. I had paid it off 18 years earlier. My name was on every document. Carol and I had built that place together, picked every tile, argued about every paint color, planted every tree in the backyard. It was a 4-bedroom house with a finished lower level, a 3-car garage, and just over half an acre. Not a small space. There was more than enough room for all of us, and I genuinely believed it could work. I believed in my son. I believed he would find his footing, and that having family nearby would be good for everyone. For the first few months, things were fine. A little awkward in the way that living with grown children always is, but manageable. My son and I had dinner together sometimes. We watched football on Sunday afternoons. His wife kept to herself mostly, which I took as shyness. She had grown up in a different kind of household than ours. More formal, I assumed. Less warm. I tried to give her space, while also making her feel welcome. Then small things started to shift. The first thing I noticed was the kitchen. My daughter-in-law began rearranging it, not dramatically at first, just moving things around, organizing the pantry her way, replacing the dish soap with a brand she preferred. I didn't say anything. It seemed petty to complain. Then she redid the pantry entirely, throwing out food I'd had for months because she said it was cluttering the space. When I mentioned it, my son laughed it off. "She's just nesting, Dad. You know how it is." I did not know how it was, but I let it go. By month 4, she had taken over the primary bedroom. Now, I should explain. I had been sleeping in the guest room since Carol died. I couldn't sleep in our old room anymore. The primary bedroom sat at the end of the hall, door usually closed, and I had left it largely untouched. My daughter-in-law asked me one evening, very casually, whether anyone was using it. I said no. I suppose not. She said it made more sense for her and my son to have it, since it was the largest room and had the ensuite bathroom. It would give us all more privacy. I told her I'd think about it. The next week, while I was out running errands, she moved in. Just like that. When I came home, her things were in my wife's room. Her perfume bottles were on Carol's dresser. Her shoes were lined up where Carol's had been. I stood in the doorway for a long time. I went to my son that evening and told him this was not acceptable. He looked uncomfortable and said his wife had mentioned I'd been considering it, and he thought it had been decided. I told him it had not been decided. He said he understood. But could we please not make it a big deal? Things were really good right now, and he didn't want any tension. He looked genuinely pained when he said it. I recognized the expression. He had worn it as a teenager whenever he wanted something but didn't want to ask directly. So I let it go again. That was my mistake. Not because I was weak, I want to be clear about that, but because I was still in the process of understanding exactly what I was dealing with. I am an engineer by training. I do not make decisions without information. And at that point, I did not yet have enough. Over the following weeks, I started paying closer attention. My daughter-in-law had opinions about everything. The furniture in the living room was outdated, and she wanted to redecorate. The backyard needed to be professionally landscaped because the current state of it was embarrassing. She mentioned to my son, within my earshot, that the house needed updating if it was ever going to be worth selling. I remember standing at the kitchen sink when she said that and going very still. Selling. That word sat in my chest like a stone. I began keeping notes, dates and times and what was said. I wrote things down in a small spiral notebook I kept in my jacket pocket. Old habit. From work documentation is everything when a project goes sideways. The turning point came on a Wednesday in November. I remember it was cold, the kind of gray Midwestern cold that settles in and doesn't apologize. I came downstairs in the morning to find my daughter-in-law sitting at the kitchen table with a real estate agent. On my kitchen table were printouts, listings, comparable sales in the neighborhood. When I walked in, neither of them seemed particularly startled. My daughter-in-law introduced the agent by first name only and said they were just doing some preliminary research. I asked what kind of research. She said that with the market the way it was, it made financial sense to consider all options. That a house this size was a lot to maintain for one person. That if I moved somewhere smaller, something more suited to my... And she paused here, very briefly. Lifestyle. Then everyone could benefit. The agent smiled at me in the practiced way of someone who has been in uncomfortable rooms before. I looked at my daughter-in-law for a long moment. Then I said good morning, poured myself a cup of coffee, and went upstairs. I called my attorney that afternoon. His name is Gerald, and I have known him for over 20 years. I told him everything. He was quiet while I talked. And when I finished, he said, "Walter, I need you to do something that is going to be very difficult. I need you to be patient. Don't react. Don't confront anyone. Let me do some work on my end, and let them keep going. The more they do, the better protected you are." I asked him why I needed protection in my own home. He said because your son is on your homeowner's insurance policy, and your daughter-in-law has been receiving mail at your address for 6 months. And depending on how this plays out, a judge might consider their tenancy rights before considering your wishes. He said the law in our state was specific, and we needed to do this carefully. I wrote all of that down too. So I waited. I kept being quiet, kept being invisible, kept watching. My daughter-in-law grew bolder. She hired a cleaning service that I didn't ask for and charged it to a shared household account. A joint account I had set up with my son when they first moved in, meant for groceries and utilities. She spent nearly $800 on curtains for the living room, replacing ones that Carol had chosen. I watched the new curtains go up without saying a word. My son noticed my silence, I think, but interpreted it as acceptance. He seemed relieved. He started spending more time at home, more relaxed, laughing more easily. He had always been someone who avoided conflict, even as a child. He would rather pretend a problem didn't exist than face it. I had not understood, until then, how dangerous that quality could become in a grown man with the wrong partner. Gerald called me 6 weeks after our first conversation. He had everything he needed. The documentation I had been sending him, photographs of mail, screenshots of the bank account charges, my dated notes, a recording I made of a conversation in which my daughter-in-law discussed the house sale in explicit terms while on a phone call in the living room. Not realizing I was in the hallway, all of it was more than sufficient. He had also done some digging of his own and discovered that my daughter-in-law had contacted 3 separate real estate agencies, not just the one I had seen. She had told at least one of them that the property would be listed in the spring. She had done all of this without my knowledge, without my consent, without my name on a single document authorizing any of it. Gerald said we were ready. He asked me how I wanted to proceed. I thought about it for a day. I sat with it. I thought about my son, about the little boy who used to fall asleep on the couch watching baseball, about how proud Carol had been at his college graduation, about the fact that none of what was happening was entirely his fault, and also entirely was. I thought about Carol's perfume bottles on her dresser, replaced now by someone else's. Then I told Gerald to proceed. The formal notice was served on a Thursday morning. I had arranged to be away from the house. I had breakfast with a friend from work, took my time, drove, slowly. Gerald had told me it was better not to be present. The notice informed my son and my daughter-in-law that they were required to vacate the property within 30 days, that any attempt to access financial accounts beyond the amounts already documented would result in legal action, and that the household account had been frozen pending review of unauthorized charges. My son called me 11 times between 8:45 and noon. I let each call go to voicemail. When I finally listened to them, the messages moved from confused to angry to something that sounded, by the end, like genuine fear. He did not understand what was happening. In his last message, his voice broke a little, and he said, "Dad, please just talk to me. Please." That one I listened to twice. I drove home that afternoon and found them both in the living room. My daughter-in-law was sitting very straight, arms crossed, with the particular expression of someone preparing to negotiate. My son was standing by the window, and when I came in, he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face since he was very young. Something open and frightened and confused. I sat down. I did not raise my voice. I am 64 years old, and I have managed large construction projects, difficult clients, and the death of my wife. I know how to stay calm. I told them both what I knew. I was specific. I named the real estate agencies. I described the conversation I had recorded in the hallway, and I watched my daughter-in-law's face change when I said that. Not guilty. Exactly. More like recalculating. I could see her thinking. My son kept saying, "I don't understand. I don't understand." So I explained it plainly. His wife had been, for several months, taking actions intended to facilitate the sale of a property she had no legal claim to, using finances she had no authorized access to, in order to profit from an asset that belonged entirely to me. That is not a misunderstanding. That is not nesting. That is not preliminary research. He turned to look at her. She said I was exaggerating. She said it had been conversations. Just conversations. Nothing had actually happened yet. Why was I making this into something it wasn't? She said I had been looking for reasons to dislike her from the beginning, that I had never accepted her, that this whole thing was about control. My son was still looking at her. He had gone very quiet. I took out my phone, and I played part of the recording, just 2 minutes of it. Her voice, clear as anything, telling someone on the other end of the line that the seller was motivated, that the property would be ready to list in April, that there was a lot of square footage to work with, and the location was excellent. Her voice, efficient and confident, selling my house to a stranger while I slept 2 rooms away. The room was very quiet after I stopped the recording. My daughter-in-law stood up and said this was ridiculous, that she needed some air, and she walked outside. Then he sat down in the chair across from me and put his face in his hands. We talked for a long time that night. I will not share all of it here, because some of it is private in the way that conversations between a father and son are private. What I will say is that my son cried, which I had not seen him do since Carol's funeral. I did not cry, because I had done my crying alone in the weeks before, in the car, driving to and from Gerald's office. By the time we sat down together, I was past the grief of it. I was in the part that comes after. He asked me if there was any way to fix it. I told him the 30-day notice stood. That was not negotiable, for reasons Gerald had explained and that I explained now to my son. But I also told him that I was not abandoning him, that he was my son and that would not change, that what needed to change was his willingness to let someone else make decisions that were not hers to make. in a house that was not hers to sell, with money that was not hers to spend. I told him that if he wanted a relationship with me going forward, it would have to be one built on honesty. And that started with him being honest with himself about what he had allowed to happen. He didn't say much after that. He nodded. He looked exhausted. My daughter-in-law came back inside later that evening. She had apparently called someone, a family member or a friend, and composed herself. She tried once more to reframe the situation. She used words like miscommunication and good intentions and working toward the same goal. I let her finish. Then I told her Gerald's contact information was in the notice she had received that morning, and that any further discussion should go through him. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and went upstairs. They moved out 26 days later, 4 days ahead of the deadline. I watched the moving truck from the kitchen window, drinking my coffee. My son came to say goodbye, and we stood on the front porch for a few minutes. He said he was sorry. I told him I knew. He said he hoped we could get past this eventually. I told him I hoped so too, and that it would depend on the choices he made going forward, not the ones he had already made. He nodded. He looked older than 33. He hugged me before he got in the car, which he hadn't done in a long time. I watched the car until I couldn't see it anymore. I spent a week alone in the house after that. I put Carol's perfume bottles back on her dresser. I took down the new curtains and found the old ones, still in a bag in the garage, and hung them back up. I filled the kitchen with the food I liked again. I sat on the back porch on a Saturday morning with a cup of coffee and just listened to the neighborhood. The birds. A lawnmower 2 streets over. The sound of a kid on a bicycle, and for the first time in almost 8 months, I felt like I was in my own home. Gerald handled the unauthorized charges. My daughter-in-law, on advice of her own attorney presumably, agreed to repay the full amount accessed from the household account, just over $4,000, in exchange for us declining to pursue additional claims. It wasn't the most I could have pushed for, but Gerald advised me that it was clean and final. And sometimes clean and final is worth more than the extra fight. I agreed. My son did call me, about a month after they moved out. We talked for a while. He was staying with a friend, had started a new job, said things between him and his wife were complicated. I didn't ask for details. I told him I was glad he called. I told him the door was not closed. It was just different now. He said he understood. I bought a new house. Not to replace the old one. I still have the house, but a small place on the lake, about an hour north. Something I had been thinking about since I retired. I went and looked at it on a Tuesday afternoon in February, and I stood on the back porch and looked at the water for about 10 minutes. And then I told the agent I'd take it. I didn't agonize over it. At 64, I have earned the right to make a decision quickly when I know it's right. I spend weekends there now. There is a small dock, and in the mornings the water is very still. And sometimes I drink my coffee and watch the mist come off the surface, and I think about Carol, and I think about my son, and I think about the strange, compressed year that changed what I understood about trust, and about patience, and about what it means to protect something you have spent your whole life building. My son called me last Sunday. We talked for almost an hour. At the end, he asked if he could come visit sometime. See the lake house. I said yes. I told him to give me a little more time. And then, yes, I think he will be okay. I think it will take work, and honesty, and the kind of humility that doesn't come easy at 33. But I think he has it in him. He is my son, after all. And I am not a man who gives up on the things that matter. But I am also not a man who lets someone sell his house from underneath him without a word. They found that out. A little later than I would have liked, maybe. But they found it out.